War Cries in Rohan. The wind swept across the vast plains of Rohan, carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant thunder of hoofbeats. Eowyn, niece of King Theoden, stood upon the ramparts of Edoras, her golden hair streaming behind her like a banner of war. The Riddermark stretched endlessly before her, a sea of green that had known peace for nigh on 3 summers since the defeat of Saruman. Yet peace, she had learned, was but a brief respite between storms. "My lady," came a voice behind her. Hama, doorwarden of the Golden Hall, approached with measured steps. "The king would speak with thee in the throne room. Riders have come from the Westfold, bearing ill tidings." Eowyn turned, her grey eyes reflecting the storm clouds gathering overhead. "What news do they bring?" "Strange happenings in the Gap of Rohan, my lady. Cattle found slain, not by wolves or bears, but by something else. And there are whispers of a sound that carries on the wind, a horn that no man of Rohan has blown." As they descended into the Golden Hall, Eowyn felt a chill that had naught to do with the approaching storm. The great pillars rose about them like the ribs of some ancient beast, and at the far end, King Theoden sat upon his throne, his weathered face grave with concern. Before him knelt 3 riders, their cloaks mud-stained and their faces drawn with exhaustion. The foremost, a man Eowyn recognized as Elfhelm of the Westfold, raised his head as she approached. "Speak again thy tale, Elfhelm," commanded Theoden, his voice carrying the authority of his long years. "Let all in this hall hear what thou hast seen." Elfhelm rose, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. "My lord king, for 7 nights past we have heard it, a horn that echoes through the Gap of Rohan, though no watchman upon our borders has sounded any call. It comes with the darkness, low and mournful, like the voice of the earth itself crying out in anguish." "And what of the beasts thou didst mention?" inquired Eomer, who had emerged from the shadows beside the throne. "Dead, my lord, cattle and horses alike, found at dawn with strange wounds upon them, not the work of fang or claw, but as if the very life had been drawn from them. The herders speak of shadows that move without form, and of dreams that plague their sleep." Theoden leaned forward, his knuckles white upon the arms of his throne. "Dreams? Aye, my lord, dreams of ancient battles, of riders in armor black as night, and of a voice that calls to them from the depths of the earth. Some of our men have begun to change. They speak of vision, of a great purpose that awaits them in the darkness." A silence fell upon the hall, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Eowyn felt the weight of destiny settling upon her shoulders like a mantle of iron. "My lord," she said, stepping forward, "grant me leave to ride to the Westfold. Let me see these strange happenings with mine own eyes." Theoden's gaze turned to her, and she saw in his eyes both pride and sorrow. "Nay, dear niece, this matter requires more than the courage of one, however valiant. Eomer, thou shalt ride with a full eord at dawn. Take with thee 50 of our finest riders." "And what of the horn?" asked Eomer. "If it be some trick of the enemy, should we not seek counsel from Minas Tirith?" Before Theoden could answer, a new voice spoke from the entrance to the hall. "The horn is no trick, King of Rohan." All eyes turned to see a figure in grey robe, leaning upon a staff, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. But as he drew closer, Eowyn felt her heart leap with recognition. "Gandalf," she breathed. The wizard nodded gravely. "I have come as swiftly as I may, for the sound thou speakest of has reached even to the borders of Fangorn. The trees themselves grow restless, and there are stirrings in the earth that speak of old evils awakening." "What know you of this horn?" demanded Theoden. Gandalf's eyes grew distant, as if looking into the depths of memory itself. "It is the horn of Helm, forged in the elder days by the dwarves of Khazad-dûm for the first king of Rohan. It was lost long ago in the wars that followed the fall of Gil-galad. Men say it was buried with its last bearer in the depths of the Haunted Mountain." "The Haunted Mountain?" Elfhelm whispered. "But that lies beyond the borders of Rohan, in the wild lands near the paths of the dead?" "Aye," said Gandalf grimly, "and if the Horn of Helm has awakened, It means that something stirs in those ancient places that should remain forever at rest. Something that calls to the blood of the Rohirrim. The great doors of the Golden Hall groaned open as dawn broke over Edoras, revealing a host of riders assembled in the courtyard below. 50 of Rohan's finest sat upon their steeds, their spears gleaming in the pale light, their banners snapping in the morning wind. At their head rode Eomer, his golden hair bound with a circlet of silver, his face set with grim determination. Éowyn watched from the steps of the hall as her brother mounted his great war-horse, Firefoot. Beside him, Gandalf sat upon Shadowfax, the grey stallion's coat gleaming like pearl in the dawn light. "Ride swift, but ride wary," called Theoden from the doorway. "And if this horn be indeed what Gandalf believes, then all our lives may hang upon what thou dost discover." Eomer raised his hand in farewell, then wheeled his horse about. "Forth, Yorlingus!" he cried, and the host rode out from Edoras like a wave breaking upon the shore. As the dust of their passage settled, Éowyn felt a hand upon her shoulder. She turned to find Theoden beside her, his face lined with worry. "Uncle," she said softly, "what if they do not return?" "Then we shall ride to their aid," he replied, "for we are the Rohirrim, and we do not abandon our own." He paused, his gaze following the distant riders. "But there is something else that troubles me, dear niece. The dreams that Elfhelm spoke of, I too have felt their touch." Éowyn turned to face him fully. "What dreams?" "Dreams of a great host, riding beneath black banners, of a voice that speaks in the old tongue, promising power beyond measure, and always, at the center of it all, a horn that calls to something deep within my blood." He shook his head. "I fear that this is no mere threat to the borders of Rohan, but something that strikes at the very heart of what we are." Meanwhile, the Eorid of Eomer rode hard across the Riddermark, their horses' hooves drumming against the earth like the heartbeat of the land itself. The sun climbed higher, but the sky remained overcast, and there was a strange quality to the light, as if it filtered through water. "The very air grows thick," observed Erkenbrand, one of Éomer's most trusted riders. "It minds me of the darkness that came before the Battle of Helm's Deep." Gandalf, who had remained silent since their departure, finally spoke. "Aye, but this is different. That darkness was brought by the hand of Saruman, a shadow cast by his will. This comes from within the earth itself, from the roots of the mountains and the bones of the land." "What mean you?" asked Éomer, spurring his horse to ride alongside the wizard. "The Horn of Helm was not merely a tool of war," Gandalf replied. "It was a binding, a ward placed upon the ancient evils that once walked these lands. If it has indeed awakened, then the bonds it maintained may be weakening." As they rode, the landscape began to change. The green fields of Rohan gave way to rougher country, where the grass grew thin and the earth showed through in patches of grey stone. Strange flowers bloomed beside the path, black as night and cold to the touch, their petals seeming to drink in the light. "I like not this place," muttered Gamling, an older rider who had served with Theoden at Helm's Deep. "It has the feel of the Barrow Downs about it." Indeed, as they crested a low hill, they saw before them a sight that made even the bravest of them pause. The land ahead was scarred with what looked like ancient earthwork, great trenches and mounds that formed no pattern recognizable to the eye of man. Yet there was something about their arrangement that spoke of purpose, of a design both alien and terrible. "The barrow fields of Rohan," said Gandalf quietly. "I had hoped never to see them again." "You have been here before?" asked Éomer. "Long ago, in the days before the founding of your kingdom. These mounds hide the remains of the Woes folk, the wild men who dwelt here before the coming of Yorl the Young. They were, changed by their contact with the ancient darkness, became something other than what they had been. As they rode among the barrows, the horses grew restless, their ears laid back and their eyes rolling white. The air grew colder, and a mist began to rise from the ground, though the sun still shone overhead. "My lord," called one of the riders from the rear of the column, "there is something following us." Éomer reined in his horse and turned to look back. At first, he saw nothing but the swirling mist and the dark shapes of the barrows, but then, at the edge of vision, he glimpsed movement, shapes that seemed to flow rather than walk, keeping pace with their column but never drawing close enough to be seen clearly. "Barrow wights," said Gandalf grimly, "the ancient dead, stirred by the same force that has awakened the horn. They cannot harm us while the sun shines, but we must be clear of this place before nightfall." "How far to the Westfold?" asked Éomer. "Too far," replied Gandalf. "We must find shelter for the night, somewhere the wights cannot follow." As if in answer to his words, a new sound reached their ears, the low, mournful note of a horn, echoing from somewhere ahead. The horses whinnied in fear, and several of the riders reached for their weapons. "The horn of Helm," whispered Erkenbrand. "It calls to us." And indeed, Éomer felt it too, a pull in his blood, a desire to ride toward the sound despite all reason. He saw the same struggle in the faces of his men, the same battle between duty and an older, deeper calling. "We ride on," he said firmly, "but stay close, and let no man stray from the path." The mist thickened as they rode, until it seemed they moved through a gray sea where the very air had substance. The barrows loomed on either side like the ribs of some vast beast, and from their depths came sounds that had no place in the world of the living, whispers in languages long forgotten, and the scrape of bone against stone. "There," said Gandalf, pointing with his staff toward a low hill that stood apart from the others, "the Beacon Hill. The Barrow wights will not approach it, for it was blessed by the Valar themselves in the elder days." As they climbed the hill, the mist began to thin, and the oppressive weight that had settled upon them lifted somewhat. At the summit stood a circle of standing stone, weathered by age, but still bearing the faint traces of runes carved in their surface. "We camp here," declared Éomer. "Set the horses in the center of the circle, and let the men rest in shift. I would have sentries watching all approaches." As the riders made their preparations, Gandalf walked among the stones, his fingers tracing the ancient rune. "These tell of the first battles against the darkness," he said to Éomer, who had come to stand beside him, "when the Valar themselves walked among men, teaching them the ways of light and warding." "And will these wards hold against what follows us?" asked Éomer. "For this night, yes, but the power that awakens grows stronger with each passing hour. We must reach the source of the horn's call before it becomes too great to resist." As night fell, the true magnitude of their peril became clear. The barrow fields below writhed with movement, as shapes emerged from the ancient mounds and began to circle the hill. They moved with purpose, these remnants of the dead, their forms shifting between solid and shadow. "My lord," called one of the sentries. "They speak!" Indeed, from the darkness below came voices, not the mindless moaning of the undead, but words in the old tongue of the Rohirrim, words of power and binding. "They seek to break the wards," said Gandalf, "to draw us down into the darkness below." But even as he spoke, a new voice arose from among the wights, deeper, more commanding than the others. The lesser spirits fell silent, and from the largest of the barrows emerged a figure that made even the bravest of the riders step back. It was tall as a man, but broader, clad in ancient armor that gleamed with a light that hurt the eyes to look upon. Its helm was crowned with antlers, and in its hand it bore a sword that seemed to drink in the very darkness around it. "Behold," whispered Gandalf, "the Barrow King himself, the last of the Woes folk, who chose to embrace the darkness rather than flee from it." The figure raised its sword, and when it spoke, its voice carried clearly to the top of the hill. "Riders of Rohan, why do you flee from that which calls to your blood? The horn of Helm sounds for you, as it sounded for your fathers and their fathers before them. Come down and claim your inheritance." Several of the riders moved toward the edge of the circle, their faces blank with longing. But Éomer stepped forward, his own sword drawn. "I am Éomer, son of Éomen, nephew of Theoden King. I do not treat with the servants of darkness." The Barrow King laughed, a sound like the grinding of stone. "Darkness? Nay, young prince. I offer you power beyond your dreams, dominion over all the lands that stretch from the misty mountains to the sea. The horn of Helm was forged for your line. Take it and become what you were meant to be. And what price would you ask for this? Gift? Demanded Eomer. No price, replied the Barrow King, only that you remember what you truly are. The Rohirrim are not farmers and herders. You are the children of the storm, the riders of the four winds. Your ancestors ruled not just Rohan, but all the lands from here to the Grey Haven. The Horn calls you to reclaim that heritage. Do not listen to his lies, warned Gandalf. The horn he speaks of is not the true Horn of Helm, but a corruption, a trap laid by the enemy to ensnare the noblest of the Rohirrim. But the Barrow King's words had found fertile ground. Eomer could feel the pull of them, the promise of power and glory that sang in his blood. And he was not alone. Around the circle, his men struggled against the same temptation. Think you that your small kingdom is the extent of your birthright? Continued the Barrow King. Your forefather Eorl the Young conquered these lands with but a few hundred riders. Imagine what you could accomplish with the power of the horn behind you. The horn of Helm was lost, said Eomer, but his voice lacked conviction. Lost? Nay, hidden by those who feared its power, who would keep the Rohirrim penned like cattle in their green fields. But it has awakened, and it calls to one who has the blood and the will to wield it. The Barrow King raised his sword, and the blade began to glow with an inner fire. Come, Eomer, king-to-be. Come and claim what is yours by right. The pull of the Barrow King's words was like a tide, washing over the assembled riders with promises of glory and power. Eomer felt his feet moving of their own accord, carrying him toward the edge of the sacred circle. Behind him, he heard the shuffle of boots as his men followed, their faces slack with yearning. "Hold!" cried Gandalf, raising his staff. White light blazed from its tip, and the Barrow King recoiled with a hiss of rage. "Remember who you are! Remember your oaths!" The light seemed to break the spell, and Eomer shook his head as if waking from a dream. But the respite was brief. Already the Barrow King was advancing up the hill, his sword leaving trails of shadow in the air. "You cannot hold us here forever, Grey Pilgrim," he snarled. "The horn calls, and the blood of Rohan will answer." "Then let us see whose will is stronger," replied Gandalf, and he began to speak words in the high tongue of the Eldar. The stones of the circle flared with ancient light, and the Barrow King stopped as if he had struck a wall. But even as Gandalf held the creature at bay, Eomer could see the strain upon the wizard's face. The Barrow King was not alone. From the mounds below, more of the ancient dead were rising, their forms growing more solid with each passing moment. "We cannot stay here," said Erkenbrand, moving to Eomer's side. "The wards weaken, and our horses grow restless." Indeed, the steeds within the circle were rearing and plunging, their eyes rolling white with terror. Several of the riders struggled to hold them, but it was clear that the animals' fear was giving way to something else, a wild madness that spoke of the same corruption that had claimed the Barrow King. "The horn's call affects all living things," said Gandalf, his voice strained. "Even the horses of Rohan are not immune to its power." As if summoned by his word, the sound came again, that deep, mournful note that seemed to resonate in the very bones of the earth. But this time it was closer, much closer, and with it came a new sound, the thunder of hoofbeats, dozens of them, approaching from the south. "Riders!" called one of the sentries. "A host approaches." Through the swirling mist, they could see torches bobbing in the darkness, and the gleam of spear points. But as the newcomers drew closer, Eomer felt his heart sink. The riders were clad in the armor of Rohan, but their faces were strange, their eyes reflecting the torchlight like those of wild beasts. "Elfhelm," whispered Erkenbrand, "but look at his men." Indeed, the Lord of the Westfold rode at the head of the approaching host. But he was changed. His face was pale as bone, and his eyes held a light that was not entirely human. Behind him rode perhaps 30 men, all bearing the same strange transformation. "Eomer!" called Elfhelm as he reached the base of the hill. Why do you tarry here among the dead? The horn calls, and we must answer. What has happened to you? Demanded Eomer. What has wrought this change? Elfhelm laughed, and the sound was like the ringing of iron on stone. Change? Nay, this is awakening. I have heard the true voice of the Horn of Helm, and it has shown me what we are meant to be. He raised his own horn, not the Horn of Helm, but a twisted thing of bone and metal that gleamed with its own inner light. When he blew it, the sound that emerged was like the cry of a hunting pack, wild and fierce and utterly without mercy. The effect was immediate. The horses within the circle reared and screamed, and several of Eomer's men cried out as if in pain. But worse was what happened to the Barrow King. The ancient creature straightened, his form becoming more solid, more real. "Yes," he cried, "the binding weakens. Soon the Horn of Helm will be free, and the true kings of Rohan will rise again." "You know not what you do," said Gandalf to Elfhelm. "The horn you bear is not a gift, but a chain. It will bind you to the darkness as surely as it has bound him." He gestured toward the Barrow King, but Elfhelm only smiled. "The darkness? You speak of shadows and evil, but I have seen the truth. The Horn of Helm was hidden not to prevent evil, but to prevent the Rohirrim from reclaiming their rightful place as lords of all Middle-earth." "And what of your people?" asked Eomer. "What of the women and children of the Westfold? Would you abandon them for this dream of conquest?" "They will follow where we lead," replied Elfhelm, "as will all the peoples of Middle-earth, once they see the power of the true kings returned." The Barrow King laughed. "Well spoken, young lord. You begin to understand. The Horn of Helm is not just a weapon, it is a key to unlock the power that sleeps in the blood of all who follow the Horse Lords. Join us, Eomer, son of Yomund, and together we shall make the earth tremble beneath our hooves." Around the circle, more of Eomer's men were wavering. The sound of Elfhelm's horn had awakened something in them, a hunger for glory and conquest that their peaceful years had kept buried. Already, several had moved to the edge of the circle, their hands reaching toward the darkness below. "We must flee," said Gandalf urgently. "The circle will not hold much longer, and when it breaks, we will be overwhelmed." But even as he spoke, cracks appeared in the ancient stones, and the light that had protected them began to flicker and fade. "Mount!" cried Eomer, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "All men to horse! We ride for Dunharrow." Took, the name of that ancient refuge, seemed to break through the spell that held some of his men. Dunharrow, the hold of the Pukul men, where the spirits of the dead were bound by oaths older than the kingdom of Rohan itself. If there was any place where they might find sanctuary from the growing darkness, it would be there. But not all of his Eord obeyed. A dozen riders remained at the edge of the circle, their faces turned toward Elfhelm and his transformed host. Their captain, a young man named Durnhelm, stepped forward. "Nay, my lord," he said, his voice strange and distant. "I have heard the true call. The Horn of Helm sounds for the children of Yorl, and I will not flee from my destiny." "Durnhelm," said Eomer, his voice heavy with sorrow, "you are bewitched. This is not destiny, but doom." "Is it?" asked Durnhelm. "Or is it the fulfillment of all that we have dreamed? To ride the world's roads as our fathers did, to claim kingdoms as our right, to hear the thunder of 1,000,000 hooves following our banner?" His eyes shone with an inner fire. "I have seen the vision, my lord. I have seen what we could become." With that, he vaulted over the stone circle and strode down the hill toward Elfhelm's host. The other wavering riders followed, their faces ecstatic with the same terrible joy. "Let them go," said Gandalf grimly. "We cannot save those who do not wish to be saved." The remaining riders, perhaps 30 in all, mounted their horses and prepared to flee. But as they did, the stones of the circle finally cracked completely, and the ancient wards collapsed in a shower of sparks. The Barrow King roared in triumph and began to ascend the hill, his sword trailing darkness. Behind him came the hosts of the dead, their forms now solid as those of living men, their eyes burning with unholy fire. "Ride!" shouted Eomer, and they plunged down the far side of the hill, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the stone. Behind them came the sound of pursuit, not just the Whites and the Barrow King, but Elfhelm's corrupted riders as well, their voices raised in a hunting cry that chilled the blood. The night became a blur of desperate flight. They rode through valleys shrouded in mist, across streams that ran black under the starlight, past standing stones that seemed to watch their passage with malevolent eyes. The very land seemed to be turning against them, as if the corruption spread by the horn's call was seeping into the earth itself. "The horses tire," called Erkenbrand, his voice barely audible over the thunder of hooves. "They cannot maintain this pace much longer." Indeed, their mounts were beginning to falter, their flanks white with foam, their breath coming in great gasps. But behind them, the pursuit seemed tireless, the corrupted riders gaining ground with each passing mile. "There," said Gandalf, pointing ahead, "the Firienfeld. We are almost to Dunharrow." Before them, the land began to rise, the gentle hills of Rohan giving way to the broken country at the feet of the White Mountain. And there, carved into the very rock of the mountainside, were the ancient steps that led up to Dunharrow, the hold of the dead, where Isildur had bound the oath-breaking men to eternal service. But as they approached the base of the steps, their way was blocked. A line of riders sat their horses across the path, their armor gleaming in the moonlight, their faces hidden behind helms of ancient design. "The dead men of Dunharrow," whispered one of the riders. "They have come forth from their haunted halls." The leader of the ghostly host raised his sword, and when he spoke, his voice was like the wind through empty halls. "Turn back, living men. This place is not for you." "We seek sanctuary," said Éomer, riding forward. "Sanctuary from the darkness that pursues us." The dead king's hollow gaze fixed upon him. "Sanctuary? There is no sanctuary for the living in the halls of the dead. Turn back, or join us in our eternal watch." "You do not understand," said Gandalf, spurring Shadowfax forward. "The Horn of Helm has awakened. The ancient bindings are breaking. Soon, all the dead of Middle-earth will be free to walk the world again." At the mention of the horn, the dead king's form seemed to solidify, becoming more real, more present. "The Horn of Helm," he said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been fear. "That name has not been spoken in these halls for 1,000 years. Then you know what it means," said Gandalf urgently. "The power that created your binding is the same power that forged the horn. If it falls into the wrong hands, all the oaths of the dead will be broken, and chaos will reign across Middle-earth." The dead king was silent for a long moment, his spectral gaze fixed upon something beyond the world of the living. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Pass," he said, and his host parted like mist before them. "But know this, the halls of Dunharrow are not what they once were. The horn's call has awakened things that should have remained sleeping. Even here, in the House of the Dead, you may find no rest." As they rode up the ancient steps, Éomer could hear the sound of their pursuers drawing closer. But more disturbing was what he saw carved into the rock walls around them. The Pukelmen, the stone guardians of Dunharrow, had changed. Their faces, once merely stern, now bore expressions of malevolent hunger, and their eyes seemed to follow the rider's passage. "The corruption spreads," said Gandalf grimly. "Even the ancient stones are not immune to the horn's influence." They reached the top of the steps, just as the first of their pursuers appeared at the bottom. Elfhelm's voice rose in a triumphant cry as he saw them outlined against the stars. "There is no escape, Éomer. The Horn of Helm calls to all who have the blood of kings. Join us, or be consumed by the darkness you flee." But Éomer had already turned away, leading his men into the shadowed halls of Dunharrow. Behind them, the dead king and his host formed a line across the entrance, their spectral forms glowing with a cold light. "They will not pass," said the dead king, "but neither will you find the peace you seek. The horn's call echoes even here, and the dead grow restless." As if to confirm his words, from the depths of the mountain came a sound that made even the bravest of the riders shiver. the scrape of bone on stone, and the whisper of ancient voices speaking words of power and binding. The halls of Dunharrow stretched before them like the ribs of some vast beast, carved from the living rock by hands that had been dust for countless ages. The air was thick with the weight of years, and every footstep echoed with the sound of eternity. But most disturbing of all was the sense that they were not alone, that something watched from the shadows, something that had been waiting for their arrival. "Light the torches," commanded Éomer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I would see what manner of refuge we have found." As flame bloomed in the darkness, the true extent of the ancient halls was revealed. The walls were covered with carvings that hurt the eyes to look upon, scenes of battle and conquest, of kings crowned and kingdoms fallen. But the figures in these carvings were not quite human, their proportions subtly wrong, their faces bearing expressions of inhuman hunger. "The Pukul men," said Gandalf, his voice heavy with foreboding. "But these are not the crude stone figures we saw outside. These are older, more detailed, as if they were carved by those who knew the true forms of the creatures they depicted." Erkenbrand shuddered. What manner of beings were they, to inspire such fear, even in death? "The first inhabitants of these mountains," replied Gandalf. "They were here when the Númenóreans first came to Middle-earth, and they were ancient even then. Men called them the Pukul men, but they knew themselves by another name, the Drúghu, the children of the stone." As they ventured deeper into the halls, the carvings grew more disturbing. Here were depicted scenes of sacrifice and dark ritual, of ceremonies performed under starless skies, and always, at the center of each scene, was the figure of a great horn, its surface covered with runes that seemed to writhe and shift in the torchlight. "The Horn of Helm," breathed Éomer. "It is shown here, in carvings older than the kingdom of Rohan itself." "Not the Horn of Helm," said Gandalf grimly. "The Horn of Helm was made by the dwarves, forged in the fires of Khazad-dûm. But this is older. This is the Horn of the First Kings, the instrument of power that the Pukul men used to bind the very stones to their will." They came to a great chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls lined with alcoves. In each alcove stood a figure carved from black stone, not the crude statues they had expected, but sculptures of such lifelike detail that they seemed ready to step forth from their niches. "The Hall of Kings," said Gandalf. "Here lie the greatest of the Pukul men, preserved in stone until the end of days." But even as he spoke, one of the figures began to move. Slowly, with the grinding sound of stone on stone, it turned its head toward them. Its eyes, carved from some mineral that caught and held the torchlight, fixed upon Éomer with an intelligence that was both ancient and terrible. "Who disturbs our rest?" it asked, its voice like the echo of avalanches. The riders backed away, their hands reaching for their weapons. But Gandalf stepped forward, raising his staff. "I am Gandalf the White, servant of the secret fire. We seek shelter from the darkness that pursues us." The stone figure's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Gandalf, yes, we remember you. You were here before. In the days when the dead king took his oath, you helped to bind us to these halls, to keep us from the world of the living." "The binding was necessary," said Gandalf. "Your people had fallen to the darkness, become something other than what they were meant to be." "And what were we meant to be?" asked the Stone King. "Guardians of the mountain paths? Servants of the tall men who came from the sea? We were the first children of Eru, the first to hear the music of creation. We were meant to be lords of all the earth." As he spoke, more of the figures began to stir, their stone forms becoming more fluid, more alive. The temperature in the hall began to drop, and frost formed on the walls. "The horn calls to us," said another of the Stone Kings, "the horn of the first kings that our fathers made in the dawn of the world. It has awakened from its sleep, and soon we shall be free to walk the earth again." "You speak of the horn as if it were a blessing," said Éomer, finding his voice at last. "But I have seen what it does to living men. It corrupts them, turns them into something monstrous." The first Stone King laughed. a sound like rockfall in the deep places of the earth. Corruption? Nay, young horse lord, the horn does not corrupt, it reveals. It shows men what they truly are, what they were always meant to be. Your friend Elfhelm has simply awakened to his true nature. His true nature was that of a loyal servant of Rohan, said Eomer fiercely, a protector of the innocent, a guardian of the weak. The horn has made him into a predator. And what is wrong with being a predator? Asked the Stone King. The strong should rule the weak. The mighty should command the meek. This is the natural order of things, the way the world was meant to be. Gandalf stepped between them, his staff blazing with white light. Enough. You speak of the natural order, but you know nothing of it. The horn you praise is a corruption of the music of creation, a discordant note that seeks to unmake all that is good and beautiful in the world. The Stone Kings hissed at the light, their forms becoming more solid, more threatening. The music of creation? You speak of songs and harmonies, but the only music that matters is the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel. The horn will restore the world to its proper state, a world where the strong rule and the weak serve. And what of mercy? Asked Eomer. What of justice? What of love? Weaknesses, spat the Stone King. The inventions of lesser beings who lack the strength to take what they desire. When the horn sounds its final note, all such foolishness will be swept away. From the depths of the mountain came a new sound, a rhythmic pounding, like the beating of a vast heart. The Stone Kings began to smile, their expressions becoming more animated, more alive. It begins, said the first king. The horn's call grows stronger. Soon the binding will break, and we shall be free to reclaim our rightful place as masters of Middle-earth. What binding? Demanded Eomer. What holds you here? The Stone King's eyes fixed upon him with terrible intensity. The same binding that holds the dead men of Dunharrow. The same binding that keeps the Barrow-wights in their ancient mound. The same binding that prevents the spirits of the damned from walking among the living. It is all connected, young prince. A great web of power that keeps the natural order in check. And the horn can break this binding? Asked Gandalf, his voice tight with concern. The horn is the binding, replied the Stone King. It was forged in the beginning to be both lock and key, both prison and freedom. In the right hands, it can chain the spirits of the dead. In the wrong hands, it can set them free. The pounding from below grew louder, and the walls of the hall began to shake. Dust rained from the ceiling, and several of the stone figures stepped fully out of their alcoves. The horn's power grows, said the first king. Even now, your corrupted friend seeks to claim it, and when he does, the world will tremble. Where? Demanded Eomer. Where is the horn kept? The Stone King smiled, an expression of terrible anticipation. In the deepest places of the earth, where the roots of the mountains meet the bones of the world. In the chamber, where the first kings bound their greatest enemy, the one they could not destroy, only contain. What enemy? Asked Gandalf, though his face suggested he already knew the answer. The first shadow, replied the Stone King, the one who came before Morgoth, before Sauron, before all the Dark Lords who followed in his wake. The horn is both his prison and his key, and your friend Elfhelm seeks to give it to him. The revelation struck the company like a physical blow. Eomer staggered, his face pale with horror, while several of his men made warding gestures against evil. Even Gandalf seemed shaken, his usually steady hands trembling upon his staff. The first shadow, the wizard whispered. I had thought it only a legend, a tale told to frighten children. No legend, said the Stone King, his voice heavy with ancient memory. We fought it in the elder days, when the world was young, and the light of the two trees still shone upon Valinor. It was a thing of pure malice, older than the Valar themselves, born from the discord that came before the music of creation. Sit, and you imprisoned it? Asked Eomer, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what he was hearing. We tried to destroy it, replied the Stone King, but it was too strong, too deeply rooted in the foundations of the world, so we bound it instead, using the horn of the first kings as both lock and key. The horn's power keeps it sleeping, but that same power calls to it, promising release. The pounding from below grew stronger, and now they could hear something else, a voice, vast and terrible, speaking words in a language that predated all the tongues of Middle-earth. "It knows," said the Stone King. "It knows that the horn's power is being used again. Each time your friend Elfhelm sounds his corrupted instrument, he weakens the binding. Soon, the first shadow will be free to walk the world again. Then we must stop him," said Éomer, his hand moving to his sword. "We must reach the horn before he does." "And how do you propose to do that?" asked the Stone King mockingly. "The path to the deep places is guarded by things that make the Barrow-wights seem like pleasant companions. The Woses who fell to the darkness in the beginning, the spirits of the damned who were bound along with the first shadow, creatures of malice and hatred that have festered in the depths for untold ages. Nevertheless, we must try," said Gandalf firmly. "If the first shadow is freed, all of Middle-earth will fall to darkness. The victory over Sauron will mean nothing if a greater evil takes his place." The Stone King studied them for a long moment, his mineral eyes glinting in the torchlight. "Very well," he said at last. "I will tell you the path. But know this, once you enter the deep places, you will not return unchanged. The darkness there is not merely the absence of light, but the presence of despair itself. It will seek to break you, to turn you into willing servants of the shadow." "We understand the risks," said Éomer. "Do you?" asked the Stone King. "Your friend Elfhelm thought he understood as well. He believed he could master the horn's power, use it for his own purposes. But the horn serves only one master, the first shadow itself. Even now, he is not truly free, but a puppet dancing to the shadow's will." The Stone King raised his hand, and the air before them shimmered like heat haze. Slowly, an image formed, a vision of Elfhelm and his corrupted riders, making their way through tunnels carved from the living rock. But their leader was changed even further, his form becoming more shadow than substance, his eyes burning with an inner fire that was not entirely his own. "Behold," said the Stone King, "your friend approaches the chamber of the horn. Soon he will claim it, and the first shadow will be free. Unless—" "Unless what?" demanded Éomer. "Unless you can reach the chamber first and claim the horn for yourself," replied the Stone King. "But know this, the horn's power is not easily mastered. It will try to corrupt you as it corrupted Elfhelm. You must be strong enough to resist its call, wise enough to see through its lies." "And if I cannot?" asked Éomer. The Stone King's smile was terrible to behold. "Then you will become the Shadow's greatest servant, and the world will burn in the flames of your ambition." Gandalf stepped forward, his staff glowing with renewed light. "There is another way. The horn's power comes from the binding itself. If we can break the binding completely, the horn will become just another instrument of music." "But that would free the first shadow," protested Erkenbrand. "Not if we are prepared for it," said Gandalf. "The shadow has been bound for so long that it has grown weak, dependent on the horn's power. If we can break the binding at the right moment, when the horn is being used to channel that power, we might be able to destroy them both." The Stone King shook his head. "Impossible. The binding is too strong, woven into the very fabric of the world. Only the horn itself can break it. Then we must ensure that when it breaks, we are ready," said Gandalf grimly. "Éomer, you and your men must reach the chamber before Elfhelm. I will prepare the counters to the binding, the words and signs that might give us a chance against the shadow." "And what of us?" asked the Stone King. "What of the Pukul men who have waited so long for freedom?" "Your freedom will come," said Gandalf, "but not at the cost of the world's enslavement. Help us, and when this is over, I will find a way to release you from your stone prison." The Stone King considered this, his ancient features twisting with thought. "Very well," he said at last, "but know this, the path to the deep places is treacherous. You will need a guide, one who knows the ways of the mountain's heart." "Who?" asked Éomer. The Stone King gestured toward one of the other figures, a smaller statue that had remained silent throughout their conversation. "Gan Burigan, last of the true Woses. He alone knows the secret paths, the ways that avoid the worst of the Shadow's guardian." The figure stepped forward, its form becoming more lifelike with each step. Unlike the others, its face bore no malice, only a deep sadness that spoke of ages of regret. "I will guide you," it said, its voice like wind through leaves. "But the path is long, and the darkness grows stronger with each passing moment. We must leave now, before Elfhelm reaches the chamber." "Then let us go," said Éomer, turning to his men. "Who among you will follow me into the depths?" To a man, they stepped forward, their faces grim but determined. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, as the riders of Rohan had always faced their greatest challenges. "Then let us ride," said Éomer, "though this time we ride not across the plains of Rohan, but through the very bones of the earth itself." The descent into the deep places of the earth was like entering the realm of nightmares made manifest. The stone guide, Gan Burigan, led them through passages that seemed to twist and turn according to no earthly logic, where the very walls pulsed with a malevolent life of their own. "Stay close," warned the ancient woes, his form flickering between solid stone and something more ethereal. "The deep roads remember all who have walked them, and not all those memories are kind." Indeed, as they progressed, the riders began to see shapes moving in the walls around them, faces pressed against the stone as if trying to break through, hands that reached out from the shadows only to dissolve at the touch of torchlight. "The bound spirits," explained Gan Burigan, "those who were caught in the great binding when the first shadow was imprisoned. They cannot die, cannot live, cannot find peace. They hunger for release, and they would gladly drag the living down to share their torment." Erkenbrand shuddered. "How many are there?" "Thousands," replied the guide. "All the woses who fell to the shadow's influence, all the men who sought to claim the horn's power for themselves, all the creatures of darkness that were bound along with their master. They are the army of the damned, waiting for the day when the binding breaks and they can walk the earth again." The path led ever downward, through caverns where the air itself seemed thick with despair. Strange formations jutted from the walls, not natural stone, but the petrified remains of creatures that had been caught in the binding's web. Their faces were frozen in expressions of eternal anguish, their reaching hands turned to granite by the weight of ages. "Do not look too long upon them," warned Gandalf, who had joined them at the last moment. "The sight of such suffering can drive even the strongest mind to madness." But even as he spoke, one of the riders, a young man named Fastred, stopped before a particularly disturbing formation. It was the figure of a woman, her face turned upward in a silent scream, her arms outstretched as if pleading for mercy. She looks like my sister," he whispered. "It is not your sister," said Gandalf firmly. "It is a trap, a snare laid by the shadow to catch the unwary. Turn away, and do not look back." But Fastred seemed unable to move, his eyes fixed upon the stone face. "She's in pain," he said. "I can hear her calling to me." "There is no sound," said Éomer, moving to his side. "Come, we must press on." "But I must help her," said Fastred, reaching toward the stone figure. "I must—" His words were cut off, as his hand made contact with the petrified woman. For an instant, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like breaking glass, the stone figure's eyes opened, revealing depths of such malevolence that several of the riders cried out in terror. "Free me," it whispered, its voice like the scraping of bone on stone. "Free me, and I will serve you forever." The corruption spread like wildfire. Other stone figures began to stir, their eyes opening, their voices joining in a chorus of pleading and promises. The very walls seemed to come alive with reaching hands and grasping claws. "Run!" shouted Gandalf, his staff blazing with light. "The binding weakens! We must reach the chamber before the shadow breaks free!" They fled through passages that seemed to shift and change around them, pursued by the voices of the damned and the scraping of stone on stone. Behind them, the petrified army was stirring to life, their forms becoming more solid, more real with each passing moment. "The horn's power grows," called Gan Burigan over the noise of pursuit. Your friend Elfhelm draws near to the chamber. Soon he will claim it, and all these creatures will be free. The passage opened into a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in darkness. In the center stood a structure that defied description, part temple, part fortress, part tomb. It was built from blocks of black stone that seemed to drink in the light, and its towers twisted upward like the horns of some monstrous beast. "The Fortress of Binding," said Ganburigan, "where the first shadow was imprisoned at the world's making. The horn lies within, in the chamber, at the fortress's heart." But even as he spoke, they could see lights moving within the structure, torches carried by figures in the armor of Rohan. Elfhelm and his corrupted riders had reached the fortress first. "We are too late," said Erkenbrand despairingly. "Not yet," said Gandalf. "The chamber is warded with protections that will take time to break. We may yet reach it in time." They ran across the cavern floor, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder as more of the stone army broke free from their bond. But ahead, from the fortress itself, came a new sound, the deep, resonant note of a horn, but not the crude instrument that Elfhelm had carried. This was something infinitely more powerful, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. "The horn of the first kings," breathed Ganburigan. "He has found it." The sound came again, longer and more sustained this time, and with it came a change in the air itself, a sense of vast power stirring, of ancient bonds beginning to fray. "The binding breaks," said Gandalf urgently. "We must reach the chamber now, before it is too late." They burst through the fortress gates, finding themselves in a labyrinth of corridors and chambers. The walls were covered with carvings that hurt the eyes to look upon, scenes of the great binding, of the first shadow's imprisonment, of the price paid by those who stood against it. "This way," called Ganburigan, leading them deeper into the structure. "The chamber lies at the heart of the fortress, where the roots of the mountain meet the bones of the world." The horn sounded again, and this time its call was answered by a voice that seemed to come from the very stones around them, a voice of such malevolence that it made the riders' blood run cold. "Free at last." The walls began to crack, and through the fissures seeped a darkness that was more than the mere absence of light. It was the presence of despair itself, the weight of eons of hatred and malice given form. "The first shadow stirs," said Gandalf. "The binding fails. We must reach the chamber before it breaks completely." They ran through corridors that seemed to stretch like elastic, past chambers where the air itself writhed with malevolent life. And always, ahead of them, the sound of the horn grew stronger, more insistent, more terrible. At last, they reached a great door carved from a single block of stone. It stood open, revealing a chamber beyond that blazed with an inner light that hurt the eyes to look upon. Within, they could see Elfhelm standing before an altar of black stone, his hands wrapped around a horn that seemed to be made of crystallized shadow. "Elfhelm!" cried Omer. "Stop! You know not what you do." But the Lord of the Westfold turned to face them, and they saw that he was no longer truly human. His form flickered between solid and shadow. His eyes burned with a light that was not his own. And when he spoke, his voice was joined by another, deeper and more terrible. "I know exactly what I do," he said, raising the horn to his lips. "I free the true king of Middle-earth from his unjust imprisonment. I restore the world to its proper order." "The proper order is chaos and despair," said Gandalf, stepping forward. "You have been deceived, Elfhelm. The shadow offers power, but it is the power of destruction alone." "And what is wrong with destruction?" asked Elfhelm, his voice now entirely subsumed by the deeper presence. "The world is corrupt, full of weakness and sentiment. It needs to be cleansed, remade in the image of strength and will." He raised the horn once more, and as he did, the chamber began to shake. The altar cracked, and from the fissures rose a darkness that had substance, a shadow that cast shadows of its own. "Behold," said the presence, speaking through Elfhelm, "the first shadow rises. The binding is broken, and the world shall know its true master at last." The darkness that rose from the cracked altar was unlike anything the riders had ever seen. It was not merely the absence of light, but a presence unto itself, a writhing mass of shadow and malice that seemed to drink in the very air around it. As it grew, the temperature in the chamber plummeted, and frost began to form on the wall. "At last," spoke the darkness, its voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. 10,000 years of imprisonment end. The world shall remember what it means to fear." Elfhelm stood transfixed, the horn still clutched in his hands, his form becoming more insubstantial with each passing moment. The corruption that had claimed him was spreading, consuming what remained of his humanity. "You promised me power," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the roar of the emerging darkness. "You promised me dominion over all the lands of Middle-earth, and so you shall have it," replied the first shadow, its form beginning to coalesce into something almost recognizable, a figure of vast height, crowned with shadow, its eyes like holes in the world itself. "You shall be my greatest servant, my herald in the world above. Through you, I shall reclaim all that was taken from me." "No," said Gandalf, stepping forward, his staff blazing with white light. "I will not permit it. In the name of the Valar, in the name of Eru Ilúvatar himself, I command you to return to your prison." The first shadow laughed, a sound like the screaming of 1,000 souls. "Your gods have no power here, Grey Pilgrim. This place exists outside their dominion, in the cracks between what is and what might be. Here, in the deep places of the earth, I am supreme." But even as it spoke, Gandalf began to chant in the high tongue of the Eldar, words of power and binding that had been old when the world was young. The white light of his staff grew brighter, and for a moment the shadow seemed to recoil. "Impressive," said the first shadow, "but futile. I am not Sauron, to be bound by words and will alone. I am the darkness that existed before the first light, the silence that came before the first song. I am the negation of all that your precious Valar have made." It gestured, and the light of Gandalf's staff flickered and dimmed. The wizard staggered, his face pale with strain. "The binding was not merely a prison," continued the first shadow. "It was a source of power, a way to drain the strength from the world above and feed it to me. Every act of evil, every moment of despair, every shadow that fell across the hearts of men, all of it flowed down to me, making me stronger." "Then why seek release?" asked Éomer, his hand on his sword, though he knew it would be useless against such a foe. "If you were growing stronger in your prison, why break free?" The first shadow's attention turned to him, and Éomer felt the weight of that gaze like a physical blow. "Because I have grown as strong as I can in hiding. Now I must walk the world again, to corrupt it directly, to turn all living things to my will. The age of light is ending, Prince of Rohan. The age of shadow begins." "I will not let you pass," said Éomer, drawing his sword. The blade seemed pitifully small in the face of such vast malevolence, but it was all he had. "You will not let me?" The first shadow laughed again. "You cannot stop me, child of Yorl. But perhaps you can serve me. Yes, I sense the strength in you, the nobility of your bloodline. You would make a fitting herald for my return." It reached out with a tendril of darkness, and Éomer felt his will beginning to waver. The shadow whispered to him of power beyond imagining, of dominion over all the lands from the sea to the mountains, of glory that would make the deeds of his forefathers seem like children's games. "Join me," whispered the first shadow. "Take up the horn, as your friend Elfhelm has done. Sound the call that will summon all the armies of darkness to my banner. Help me remake the world in the image of strength and will." Éomer's hand began to move toward the horn, drawn by a power greater than his own will. But as his fingers nearly touched the crystalline surface, another voice spoke. "Remember who you are." It was Gan-Buri-Gan, the ancient woes, his stone form glowing with a light that was warm and golden. "Remember the green fields of Rohan, the laughter of children, the love of your people. Remember what you fight for." The words broke the shadow's hold, and Eomer jerked his hand back. "I remember," he said firmly. "I remember that I am a rider of Rohan, a protector of the innocent. I will not serve you." "Then you will die," said the first shadow, its voice now filled with rage. "You will all die, and I will raise your corpses to serve as my slaves." It began to expand, filling the chamber with its presence. The walls cracked and buckled, and the ceiling began to collapse. But even as it grew, something else was happening. The horn in Elfhelm's hands was beginning to change, its crystalline surface becoming clouded, its power beginning to wane. "The horn!" gasped Gandalf, understanding at last. It was never meant to be a weapon. It was a conduit, a way to channel the shadow's power. But if the shadow is freed, the horn becomes just another instrument. "What are you saying?" asked Eomer. "I am saying that the horn's power is fading," replied Gandalf. "The binding is breaking, yes, but that means the horn can no longer draw power from the imprisoned shadow. It becomes mortal, vulnerable." The first shadow seemed to realize what was happening at the same moment. "No!" it roared. "The horn is mine. It has always been mine." But even as it spoke, Elfhelm's form began to solidify, becoming more human once again. The corruption was leaving him, driven out by the horn's failing power. "What? What have I done?" he whispered, looking around the chamber in horror. "You have been deceived," said Gandalf, "but it is not too late. The horn still holds enough power to rebind the shadow, but only if it is used by one who truly understands its nature." "And who would that be?" asked Eomer. Gandalf's eyes turned to Gunburigan, who nodded slowly. "The Woses made the horn," said the ancient guide. "Only a Wose can unmake it." "But you are bound in stone," protested Eomer. "How can you use it?" "The same way the shadow was bound," replied Gunburigan, "through sacrifice, through the willing surrender of life itself." He stepped forward, his stone form beginning to crack and crumble. "I have waited long for this moment, for the chance to undo the great mistake of my people. We should have destroyed the horn when we had the chance, not hidden it away." "No," said the first shadow, its voice now tinged with desperation. "You cannot. I will not be bound again." But Gunburigan was already reaching for the horn, his crumbling fingers closing around its surface. As he did, the chamber filled with a light that was older than the sun, older than the stars themselves, the light of creation, of the music that had shaped the world. "By the power of the first song," he said, his voice growing stronger, even as his form grew weaker, "I bind you once more." First shadow, "I bind you not to stone or earth, but to the silence between the notes, the pause between the words. There you shall remain until the end of all things." The horn began to sing, a sound more beautiful than any earthly music, and the first shadow screamed as it was pulled back into the darkness from which it had emerged. Its form began to shrink, to condense, to fade. "This is not the end," it cried as it vanished. "I will return. I will always return, Sita." But its voice grew fainter and fainter, until at last there was only silence. The silence that followed the first shadow's banishment was profound, broken only by the sound of falling stone as the ancient chamber began to collapse around them. Gunburigan's sacrifice had not only bound the shadow, but had also shattered the foundations of the fortress of binding itself. "We must leave," said Gandalf urgently, his staff once again blazing with light. "The entire structure is coming down." They fled through corridors that buckled and twisted, past chambers where the walls folded in upon themselves like origami made of stone. Elfhelm, now restored to his true form, but weakened by his ordeal, was supported by two of the riders as they ran. "The horn!" he gasped as they reached the outer gates. "What became of it?" "Destroyed," replied Gandalf. "Gunburigan's sacrifice unmade it completely. The power that created it has been returned to the music of creation, where it belongs." They burst from the collapsing fortress just as the last of its towers fell, sending up a cloud of dust and debris that filled the vast cavern. Behind them, The petrified army of the damned crumbled to dust, their long torment finally at an end. But their escape was not yet complete. The cavern itself was beginning to collapse, great chunks of stone falling from the ceiling like a deadly rain. They ran across the uneven floor, dodging falling debris and leaping over widening cracks in the earth. "The passage!" called Erkenbrand, pointing toward the tunnel through which they had entered. "It still stands!" But as they reached the tunnel mouth, they found their way blocked by a familiar figure, the dead king of Dunharrow, his spectral form glowing with an inner light. "Turn back," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "The deep roads are collapsing. There is no safe passage to the surface." "Then we are trapped," said Éomer grimly. "Not trapped," said the dead king. "Chosen. The binding that held the first shadow also held us, the Oathbreakers of Isildur. With its destruction, we are free at last to fulfill our true purpose." "What purpose?" asked Gandalf. The dead king smiled, and, for the first time, his expression held something other than despair. "To serve the living as we should have served in life, to guide you to safety, and, in doing so, to find our own peace at last." He raised his spectral sword, and the blade blazed with a light that was warm and golden. "Follow me," he said. "I know paths through the mountain that the living have never seen, roads that were old when the world was young." They followed the dead king through passages that seemed to exist in several dimensions at once, where the walls were sometimes stone and sometimes mist, where the very air sparkled with the essence of starlight. Behind them came the sound of the cavern's final collapse, a rumble that shook the very bones of the earth. "The paths of the dead," explained the dead king as they walked. "They connect all the places where the dead have walked, all the roads that lead from life to whatever lies beyond. We have walked them for 3,000 years, seeking our release. And now you have found it?" asked Éomer. "Now we have earned it," replied the dead king. "By serving the living one final time, by guiding you to safety, we fulfill the oath we broke so long ago. The curse is lifted, and we can find our rest at last." The path led upward through realms of shadow and starlight, past vistas that defied description. They saw the roots of mountains laid bare, the underground rivers that fed the springs of the world, the vast chambers where the bones of ancient dragons lay in state. "How far?" asked Erkenbrand, his voice hushed with awe. "Distance has no meaning here," said the dead king. "We travel not through space, but through story itself, through the tales that connect all things. Soon we will emerge into the world of the living, but not where you might expect." Indeed, when they finally stepped from the shadow realm into the light of day, they found themselves not in the halls of Dunharrow, but on the plains of Rohan itself, not far from the walls of Edoras. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the air was sweet with the scent of grass and flowers. "How is this possible?" asked Éomer, looking around in wonder. "The paths of the dead lead everywhere and nowhere," replied the dead king. "They are the roads between moments, the bridges between heartbeats. We have brought you home, Prince of Rohan, to the land you love above all others." As he spoke, his form began to fade, becoming more translucent with each passing moment. Around them, other spectral figures materialized, the entire host of the dead men of Dunharrow, their faces peaceful at last. "Our watch is ended," said the dead king, his voice growing fainter. "We go now to whatever lies beyond, to the halls of our fathers, and the peace we have so long sought. Remember us not as oath-breakers, but as those who found redemption in service to the living." "We will remember," said Éomer solemnly, "and we will honor your sacrifice." The dead king smiled one last time, then turned and walked away across the plain, his host following behind him. As they went, they seemed to become part of the morning mist itself, until at last they were gone, leaving only the whisper of wind through grass to mark their passing. "It is finished," said Gandalf, leaning heavily on his staff. "The first shadow is bound, the horn is destroyed, and the dead have found their rest. The world is safe once more." But even as he spoke, Éomer felt a chill wind blow across the plain, carrying with it the scent of distant storms. The first shadow might be bound, but its words echoed in his memory. "I will return. I will always return." "For now," said Éomer quietly. "The world is safe for now." The return to Edoras was a journey through a landscape transformed. Where once the plains of Rohan had stretched green and unbounded, now there were scars upon the earth, great trenches and furrows that spoke of the shadow's brief awakening. The very grass seemed different, shot through with veins of silver that caught the light in strange ways. "The bindings breaking has changed things," observed Gandalf as they rode. "The barriers between the world of the living and the realm of the dead have been weakened. It will take time for the natural order to reassert itself." Indeed, as they traveled, they encountered other signs of the upheaval. Streams ran backwards for short distances before resuming their normal course. Ancient stones that had stood for millennia had shifted position, as if the earth itself had shrugged in its sleep. And sometimes, in the corner of one's eye, there were glimpses of figures that were not quite there, echoes of the dead who had found their rest, shadows of peace settling over the land. The most profound change, however, was in Elfhelm himself. The Lord of the Westfold rode in silence, his face gaunt with the memory of what he had done and what he had nearly become. When they made camp on the second night, he finally spoke to Omer of his ordeal. "I remember it all," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every moment of corruption, every choice I made in service to the shadow. I told myself I was seeking power for Rohan, strength to protect our people. But in truth," he paused, his hands shaking, "in truth, I hungered for dominion itself. The shadow did not corrupt me. It merely revealed what was already in my heart." "That is not true," said Éomer firmly. "I have known you since we were children, Elfhelm. You are a good man, a protector of the innocent. The shadow twisted your thoughts, made you see strength where there was only destruction." "Was it the shadow?" asked Elfhelm. "Or was it simply the truth? We are warriors, Éomer. We are the descendants of conquerors who rode out of the north and claimed these lands by force of arms. Perhaps the shadow simply awakened our true nature." Gandalf, who had been listening from across the fire, shook his head. "The shadow speaks many lies, but its greatest lie is that strength and cruelty are the same thing. Your ancestors conquered, yes, but they also protected. They built as well as destroyed. The shadow would have you believe that only the conquest matters, that mercy is weakness and love is folly." "But how do I know?" asked Elfhelm desperately. "How do I know which thoughts are mine, and which were planted by the shadow? How do I trust myself again?" "By your actions," said Éomer. "By choosing, each day, to serve rather than to rule. By protecting the weak rather than preying upon them. By remembering that true strength lies not in taking what you desire, but in sacrificing what you want for what is right." On the third day, they crested the hill overlooking Edoras and saw the golden hall gleaming in the afternoon sun. But something was wrong. No banners flew from its towers, no guards stood upon its walls. The city below seemed strangely quiet, as if it held its breath. "Something has happened," said Erkenbrand grimly. They rode hard down the slope and through the empty streets of the city. Here and there they saw faces peering from windows, but the people seemed afraid to come out into the open. It was not until they reached the steps of the Golden Hall that they encountered another living soul. Hama, the door warden, sat upon the steps, his head in his hands. When he looked up at their approach, his face was haggard with exhaustion and worry. "My lord Éomer," he said, rising unsteadily, "thank Eru you have returned. We had feared. When the earth shook and the darkness rose in the south, we feared the worst." "What has happened here?" demanded Éomer. "Where is the king?" "Within," said Hama. "But he is not well. The same madness that struck in the Westfold came here 3 days past. Men began to hear voices, to see visions of conquest and glory. Some rode out into the night, following dreams of power. Others," he gestured toward the silent city, "others simply disappeared. They entered the Golden Hall to find it nearly empty. The great throne sat vacant, and only a handful of guards remained at their post. They found Theoden in his private chamber, sitting by a window that looked out over the Riddermark. He seemed to have aged years in the few days they had been gone. "Uncle," said Éowyn, who had been sitting beside him. She rose as they entered, her face lighting with relief. "You have returned safe." "Safe and successful," said Éomer, embracing his sister. "The horn is destroyed, the shadow bound once more. The madness should pass." "Should?" asked Theoden, turning from the window. "But will it? I felt its pull, nephew. Even here, in the heart of Rohan, I heard the horn's call. It promised me such things: dominion over all the lands from the sea to the mountains, armies beyond counting, glory that would make the deeds of my fathers seem like children's game." "Lies," said Gandalf gently. "All of it lies, designed to corrupt the noble heart of Rohan." "Were they?" asked Theoden. "Or were they simply the truth I was too weak to embrace?" "The Rohirrim were once conquerors, Gandalf. We carved out our kingdom with sword and spear. Perhaps we have grown soft in our green field, forgotten what we truly are." "You are what you choose to be," said Gandalf, "and you have chosen to be protectors rather than predators, guardians rather than conquerors. That is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength." But even as he spoke, a commotion arose in the courtyard below. Shouts, a clash of steel echoed through the windows, and a moment later one of the guards burst into the chamber. "My lord king!" he gasped. "Riders approach from the east. They bear the banners of Rohan, but they are not as they should be." They rushed to the window and looked out to see a host of perhaps 50 riders approaching the city. They wore the armor of Rohan and carried its banners, but there was something wrong about them. Their faces were pale as bone, their eyes reflected the light like those of wild beasts, and their horses moved with an unnatural silence. "The missing riders," said Éowyn quietly. "They have returned, but not as they were." At the head of the host rode a figure they all recognized, Deorwyn, one of the king's most trusted captains, who had disappeared on the first night of the madness. But he was changed, his form flickering between solid and shadow, his voice carrying on the wind, though his lips did not move. "Theoden King," he called, "come forth. The horn may be destroyed, but its call echoes still in our hearts. We have seen the truth of what we are, what we were meant to be. Join us, and reclaim your birthright as a king of kings." "Do not listen," warned Gandalf. "They are caught between life and death, corrupted by the shadow's touch. The horn's destruction has not freed them. It has trapped them in a state of eternal hunger." But already some of the remaining guards were moving toward the doors, their faces slack with longing. The corruption was spreading, even with the horn destroyed, carried now by those who had been touched by its power. "It seems," said Theoden grimly, "that our victory is not as complete as we had hoped." The revelation struck the defenders of Edoras like a physical blow. The destruction of the horn had not ended the shadow's influence, but had merely changed its nature. Those who had been corrupted now carried the infection within themselves, spreading it like a plague wherever they went. "How many?" asked Éomer, watching the approaching host from the window of the Golden Hall. "Too many," replied Hama grimly. "Reports have come from across the Riddermark, in every settlement, in every stronghold. Some have vanished in the night. If they all return, as these have, then Rohan faces its gravest hour," said Theoden, rising from his chair with visible effort. "Not conquest from without, but corruption from within." He turned to face them all, and for a moment the fire of his younger days blazed in his eyes. "But we are the Rohirrim. We do not yield to despair." "What would you have us do, my lord?" asked Erkenbrand. "Sound the muster," commanded Theoden. "Let every horn in Rohan ring out, calling all loyal men to Edoras. If we are to face the darkness, we shall face it united." As the horns of Edoras began to sound, their clear notes ringing across the plains, Gandalf drew Éomer aside. "There is something you must know," the wizard said quietly. "The corruption is not random. It seeks out those with the strongest will, the noblest hearts. It is drawn to leadership like a moth to flame. "You mean it will come for the king," said Éomer. "It will come for all of you," replied Gandalf. "You, your sister, Theoden himself." The Shadow's final gambit is to corrupt the very heart of Rohan's nobility, to turn its greatest defenders into its most dangerous enemies. Even as he spoke, they could hear Deorwin's voice rising from the courtyard below, no longer calling for surrender, but beginning to weave a more subtle spell. He spoke of the old days, of the glory of conquest, of the destiny that awaited those brave enough to seize it. "He speaks truth mixed with lies," observed Éowyn, who had joined them at the window. "That is what makes it so dangerous. The Rohirrim did ride to war in the old days. We did carve out our kingdom with strength of arms. And therein lies the trap," said Gandalf. "The Shadow does not seek to make you evil. It seeks to make you more than you are, to amplify your virtues until they become vices. Courage becomes recklessness. Strength becomes cruelty. Pride becomes hubris." Below in the courtyard, more of the guards were wavering. Deorwin's words were finding fertile ground in hearts that had always treasured the old tales of heroism and conquest. Several had already moved toward the gates, their faces bright with the same terrible eagerness that had marked Elfhelm's transformation. "We cannot fight them with swords," said Éomer. "They are our own people, corrupted, but not evil in their hearts." "Then how do we fight them?" asked Éowyn. It was Elfhelm who answered, his voice heavy with hard-won wisdom. "With truth," he said, "with the truth of what we have learned, what we have seen. The Shadow promises power, but power for its own sake is meaningless. It promises glory, but glory built on the suffering of others is no glory at all." "Words will not be enough," said Theoden. "They must see the choice clearly, must understand what they are truly choosing. Then we give them that choice," said Éomer suddenly. "We do not hide from them or fight them. We meet them openly, show them what we have learned, let them see both paths laid bare before them." "That is madness," protested Erkenbrand. "If they are corrupted, they will try to corrupt us as well." "Perhaps," said Éomer, "but it is the only way to break the cycle. The Shadow's power comes from secrecy, from whispered promises and hidden truths. If we bring everything into the light may be enough to burn away the darkness," finished Gandalf, understanding. "It is a terrible risk, but it may be our only hope." Theoden considered this, his weathered face grave with thought. Then, slowly, he nodded. "It shall be as you say. We will meet them in the open, all of us together. Let the truth speak for itself." They descended to the courtyard, where the remaining loyal guards had formed a defensive line before the gates. Beyond, Deorwin's host waited, their pale faces turned expectantly toward the Golden Hall. "Open the gates!" commanded Theoden, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "My lord!" protested one of the guards. "They are corrupted. They will see us as we truly are," said Theoden firmly. "And we will see them. Open the gates." Slowly, reluctantly, the great gates of Edoras swung open. Deorwin's host advanced into the courtyard, their horses' hooves making no sound on the stone. As they drew closer, the extent of their transformation became clear. They were no longer entirely human, their forms flickering between solid and shadow, their eyes holding depths that spoke of terrible knowledge. "Theoden King," said Deorwin, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space, "you have opened your gates to us. Does this mean you will hear our words?" "I will hear them," replied Theoden, "but I will also speak my own. You offer power and glory, but what is the price?" "No price," said Deorwin, "only the courage to seize what is rightfully ours. The lands beyond Rohan stretch empty and undefended. The kingdoms of men grow weak and complacent. We could rule them all, bring order and strength to a world grown soft." "And what of the people who live in those lands?" asked Éowyn. "What of their children, their hopes, their dreams?" "They will serve," said Deorwin simply, "as is right and proper. The strong should rule the weak. This is the natural order." "Is it?" asked Elfhelm, stepping forward. "I thought, as you do now, friend Deorwin. I heard the Shadow's whispers, and believed them to be truth. But I have seen where that path leads. Power without compassion is not strength. It is the absence of strength. Glory without honor is not victory. It is the deepest defeat. For a moment, Deorween's form seemed to waver, and something almost human flickered in his eyes. Elfhelm, but you heard the call. You understood what we could become. I understood what I wanted to become, replied Elfhelm, but wanting something does not make it right. The shadow showed me visions of conquest and dominion, but it could not show me peace. It could not show me joy. It could not show me love, because these things cannot be taken. They can only be given freely. Love is weakness, said Deorween, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Asked Éomer. Is it weakness that makes me willing to die for my sister? Is it weakness that makes my uncle spend sleepless nights worrying for his people? Is it weakness that makes our soldiers fight not for glory, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves? Around the courtyard, the corrupted riders were beginning to stir uneasily. Some of them looked uncertain, their pale faces twisted with confusion. You offer us the world, said Theoden, his voice carrying the authority of kingship. But what use is a world without those we love to share it? What use is power without mercy to temper it? What use is glory without honor to give it meaning? These are just words, said Deorween desperately. Pretty words to mask the reality of weakness and defeat. We could be gods among men. And what use are gods? Asked Gandalf, stepping forward, his staff glowing with gentle light, if they have no one left to love them. The question hung in the air like a physical presence. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then, slowly, one of the corrupted riders dismounted from his horse. As his feet touched the ground, his form began to solidify, becoming more human, more real. I remember, he said wonderingly. I remember my wife's face, my children's laughter, the simple joy of a warm hearth on a cold night. He looked up at Deorween with eyes that were fully human once more. What good is ruling the world if I lose my soul in the process? Others began to follow his example, dismounting, their forms becoming solid, their faces regaining their humanity. But not all of them. Some, including Deorween himself, remained mounted, their forms growing more shadowy, more distant. You choose slavery, Deorween said sadly. You choose weakness and limitation, and the small concerns of small lives. But I have seen what we could be. I have touched infinity itself. I will not go back to being merely human. Then you choose exile, said Theoden firmly, for you are no longer of Rohan. You are no longer one of us. Deorween nodded, his form becoming translucent. So be it. But know this, the shadow's truth will spread. Others will hear the call and answer it. Others will choose power over love, strength over mercy. We will return, and when we do, you will remember this day as your last chance to choose the winning side. With that, he turned his horse and rode from the courtyard, those who had chosen to remain corrupted following behind him. As they passed through the gates, they seemed to fade like morning mist, becoming one with the shadows of the coming night. Will they truly return? Asked Éowyn as they watched the last of them disappear. Perhaps, said Gandalf, but not soon and not as they were. They have chosen their path, just as you have chosen yours. And your path, the path of compassion and sacrifice, is stronger than theirs. Love endures where power fails. Hope survives where pride falls, and mercy triumphs where cruelty destroys itself. As the sun set over the plains of Rohan, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the people of Edoras emerged from their homes. They came slowly at first, then with growing confidence, as they saw their king and his knights standing unharmed in the courtyard. The corruption had been faced and overcome, not through force of arms but through the simple power of truth and love. And though the shadow's whispers would always echo in the dark places of the world, on this day at least, the light had proven stronger than the darkness. Epilogue. The Song of Rohan. Years passed, and the events of those dark days became legend. Songs were sung in the golden hall of the Horn of the First Kings, and the shadow that sought to claim it. Children grew up hearing tales of brave Éomer and wise Gandalf, of noble Elfhelm, who found redemption, and ancient Gan Burigan, who made the ultimate sacrifice. But the greatest song of all was simpler than any of these grand tales. It was the song of ordinary people, choosing love over power, mercy over strength, hope over despair. It was the song of Rohan itself, not the kingdom of conquest and glory that the shadow had promised, but the kingdom of green fields and warm hearths, of loyalty and friendship and all the small joys that make life worth living. And in the deep places of the earth, bound once more, but never truly destroyed, the first shadow waited and listened to that song. It raged against the bars of its prison, but it could not deny the truth that the song proclaimed, that love, in the end, was indeed stronger than darkness. For the light of the Rohirrim burned not in conquest or glory, but in the simple choice to protect rather than to prey, to serve rather than to rule, to love rather than to fear. And that light, once kindled, could never truly be extinguished. Thus ended the war cries in Rohan, not with the clash of steel or the thunder of hooves, but with the quiet victory of hearts that chose to remain human in the face of inhuman temptation. And in that choice lay the true strength of the Horse Lords, the power that no shadow could ever corrupt or claim. Here ends the tale of the war cries in Rohan, as it was sung in the halls of Edoras in the days when Éomer was king, and the memory of the shadow's temptation served as a reminder that the greatest victories are often won not on the battlefield, but in the human heart.